Good morning. Uh, every once in a while, a song will invoke a memory. And when Maverick sang a servant song, I was reminded that I had a youth minister growing up, Brian Brophy. I'll speak his name. Brian Brophy, when we wouldn't do what he wanted us to do, he would often say, "Lord, make Bryce a servant. Lord, make him like you." And I was in the back thinking about that because that's something you get at church, right? That's what makes church special is are people like that, but experiences like that we share together. And so I was thinking about that, but I'm thankful for all of you too because you guys make this church a special place. So thank you for being who you are. Let's go to the Father in prayer, and then we'll get started. Heavenly Father, God, thank you for today. God, thank you for this opportunity to come together as a church family, God, throughout our busy weeks and schedules, God, all the things that we have going on, God, we come here to be one for just a little while. God, to sing praises, to study your word, to share in communion as well, God, thank you for that. God, as we turn our attention to Scripture this morning, we ask that you use the words to move us, to shape us into who you want us to be. And it's through your Son that we pray. Amen. This morning, we're going to be looking at the book of Esther. So if you want to turn there, that'll be where we will be the entirety of this sermon. But I want to tell a story before we get to the book of Esther. So on July 20th, 1969, Neil Armstrong took the first step of humankind on the moon. This was, without a doubt, a magnificent feat for humankind. Something that had never been done before. And it's easy to focus on those first steps and overlook all the things that took to get to those steps. Because Neil Armstrong did not just one day decide to go into a rocket ship and say, "I want to go to the moon on this particular day." There were years and decades of planning, of research, probably math, other things like that, beyond my purview. There were a lot of things that took place. There were a lot of individuals that pushed space exploration. One particular individual was President John F. Kennedy, who made space exploration one of his key figures of his campaigns. He believed that humanity, specifically the United States of America, should be on the moon by the end of the 1960s. Unfortunately, Kennedy never saw that. He was assassinated well before Neil Armstrong stepped foot on the moon on July 20th, 1969. But the work for that began well before those first steps. And one of the things that Kennedy did to push space exploration, as well as the importance of it, was he would often visit NASA. Here's a picture of Kennedy exploring one of the rocket ships they're going to use. But Kennedy would show up. Now, we do this for kind of two main reasons. One, it looked great in campaign stuff. But two, it showed that he was behind this. That the energy of the office of the presidency of the United States of America was behind this mission. Now, there's a story that goes around with Kennedy and some of these visits, that on one particular visit, Kennedy was walking through the halls of NASA. And as he was walking through the halls, he would generally meet people, introduce himself, do kind of short conversation. But on one particular day, Kennedy ran into a janitor. And the story goes that they start small talk to where Kennedy eventually asks him, "So what do you do around here?" Now, I don't know the intent behind that question. Perhaps it was just small talk. But I guarantee you that Kennedy expected the man to say something of "I'm in charge of cleaning this floor," or "I do this, and my colleague does this." He thought that he was going to get a response related toward janitorial services. But the story goes that the janitor turned to the President of the United States, John F. Kennedy, and said, "I'm helping get a man to the moon." That line stuck with Kennedy. And he would tell that story on campaign speeches well beyond that interaction. Because it reminded Kennedy, and it should remind us too, that regardless of our position, we are all part of a larger goal. We are all working towards something that is perhaps bigger than ourselves. That janitor reminded Kennedy that day that he had a job and his job was to help get a man to the moon. I love that story so much I used it in my opener of this sermon. But I love that story because I think it connects to the book of Esther. Esther is probably my favorite Old Testament book to preach on, because every time I preach on it, I see something different. It's that rabbinical way of turning the ruby. You turn that a little bit and you see a whole different side of God. Because as a kid, I used to look at this story as Isla would say, a princess story. But as an adult, I see so many different weird characteristics that are rooted within the story. Yes, it is this heroic tale of Esther standing up and doing what is right, but it's also satire and comedy and exaggeration to make fun of rulers who do ridiculous and comical things. The book of Esther has all of that within it. And so it's a fantastic book of the Bible, especially when we're talking about influence, because we see that rooted in the story. And the story doesn't even wait to get into the exaggeration, to the ridiculousness of what's going on here. The story begins with this exaggerated party in chapter 1. King Xerxes is in power, and what he has done to showcase his wealth, to showcase his power, he throws the biggest party that you could ever imagine. They are eating good and they are drinking good. This party, as you can assume, gets out of control pretty fast. And this party actually spirals out into another party, which is kind of where the book really begins. Because the book is about all these tensions of like, who is going to influence who? And who are you going to listen to? And more than that, do you realize that you have an influence on others? So King Xerxes throws this party. They get very intoxicated. And at one point, they suggest that Queen Vashti should come before them. Now, there's a lot of cultural nuances that are in the text. But what happens is Queen Vashti does not want to do what they want her to do. And they say, if you're not going to do what we want you to do, then you need to get out of here. Now, there's, again, cultural nuances of whether or not she was executed or just removed. We'll try to keep this PG, so we'll say she was removed. But her removal makes space for another person to come into the picture, which is where we find ourselves in chapter 2 of the book of Esther. Because in chapter 2, we meet a man by the name of Mordecai. Mordecai is an established Jewish man who is in this particular community due to the Babylonian exile. And I want to stop right there and say something about that. Because I don't know where everybody is right now in their lives. You may be in a place right now that you're like, I don't want to be here. I'm not happy with where I am. I'm disappointed that my life has not gone the way that I wanted it to. I guarantee you that Mordecai felt some of that. He would have much rather have been home, not part of an exile. But he finds himself there in this moment. And so if you find yourself feeling that way, hear me out, because what we learn from Mordecai's life is that God can still use you in whatever position or place you find yourself in. God can take your disappointment. God can take your pain, even your confusion, and God can use that if you allow God to. Because I believe that's where we meet Mordecai. A man who is disappointed that his life has not gone the way that it has. Because along with being a well-established Jewish man in this community, Mordecai is also a caregiver for someone. The text tells us that Mordecai had a cousin named Hadassah, whom he had brought up because she had neither father nor mother. It's likely that this was also not part of Mordecai's larger life plan. He probably did not anticipate having to raise this young woman because her parents died. But he still does it. God can use those redirections if we allow God to. And instead of closing the door here, what Mordecai does is he takes in Hadassah. Now, Hadassah is the namesake of the book, the woman that we identify as Esther. For just a moment, nerd talk. Hadassah in Hebrew means myrtle. And that is more so a symbol of peace in this culture. But Esther in Persian means rising star. So then NASA. Do you see what we're doing here? We're connecting dots. Space. But Esther in Persian identifies like a rising star. I love that about her name, because this is an unlikely individual that you see rising in this story. But what's powerful about that name is that Esther doesn't do it alone. Mordecai is with her. He is her anchor in this story. When her parents die, Mordecai steps in. As Esther's story develops and she finds herself in the palace, Mordecai doesn't leave. He stays there. A lot of questions. My dad would say, what's his job? Doesn't he have something to do? Doesn't matter. Mordecai is there. He's consistent. He's present in every moment and angle of Esther's life. At every exit ramp where he could abandon and do something else, he doesn't. That consistency and that presence is an identity marker of Mordecai. It's who he is. He's not going to abandon her when things change, when things get difficult. He is consistent in the same way that God is consistent in our lives. When they don't go the way that we want them to. When they don't go the way that we think that we need them to. And even though, and this is probably my favorite part of the book of Esther, even though God's name is never mentioned once, God's characteristics are found throughout. Throughout the way that Mordecai stays with Esther. The courage and confidence that Esther has, those are all markers of who God is. And although the name is never mentioned by any character in the book, God is there. And God is present. Another reminder that God will never leave us. Whatever situation in life that we find ourselves in. But Mordecai in chapter 2, and this is where the book becomes a little bit comical. Because Mordecai is just at the palace one day. And is presumably sitting there when two of the royal guards are at a very weird volume level discussing how they're going to assassinate the king. Again, this is supposed to be a little bit exaggerated and a little bit comical. I've never considered assassinating anybody, but if I were to, I would do it probably in secrecy. These two individuals, I forgot we're recording this. That was a really weird thing to say. But my point is this. It's like, so, lawyers here. Talk to you after this. But my point is this. That's what's being drawn out in the story, is this comical reaction to these two men who are just declaring that this is what they're going to do. The text here is, during the time Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's officers who guarded the doorway, became angry and conspired to assassinate King Xerxes. But Mordecai found out about the plot and told Queen Esther, who in turn reported it to the king, giving credit to Mordecai. Again, this is supposed to be a little bit funny, that these two kind of ridiculous individuals are doing this in a very careless and reckless way, but Mordecai is there. He is consistent. He is present. He is there, and what Mordecai does is he uses his position to help the king. Sometimes we believe that we have to have status, that we have to have this elevated platform in order to do anything. Mordecai does not have this in this kingdom. He is identified, well established, because of who's writing the book, not because of the culture that he finds himself in. But he still uses that position, regardless of how elevated that may be, to do something good. Don't disqualify yourself because of where you find yourself. Continue to do what God has called you to do, even if you feel like it's above you or bigger than you, because God needs you to step into these doorways when the doors open. Mordecai could have easily said, not my problem. I'm not going to deal with this. I'm going to keep quiet. I'm going to stay low. But he knows that this door has opened for a reason. And he tells Esther. And because of this, these two individuals, their plan is stopped. It saves the king. But the story develops more, because once this crisis is squashed, another one arises. Because in chapter 3, we learn of a man that is just awful. His name is Haman. And Haman hates the Jews. His entire identity and purpose is wrapped up in how do I do a genocide on the Jewish people. He plots for this, he plans for this, and eventually he gets the ear of King Xerxes. And this is where you see the other side of influence. Because we're contrasting Haman and King Xerxes with Mordecai and Esther. Whereas Mordecai continues to encourage and build up and lift up Esther, Haman is speaking into King Xerxes and saying, I don't trust these people. We should stop these people. We should kill these people. And for a while, King Xerxes buys into this. He listens to this. He allows this to shape him and change him a little bit. But again, here comes Mordecai. He is in the right place at the right time. Again, consistent, present. The same way that God is in our lives. Even when we don't see God, maybe we don't hear God or feel God, God is there. God is working behind the scenes in your lives. In the same way that Mordecai is working behind the scenes in the story. But this time, Mordecai realizes the severity of this. Because this isn't just an assassination attempt. This is a plot against all the Jewish people. And Mordecai responds with that in mind. He tears his clothes. This public declaration of the pain and the agony that he feels. And then after this public declaration, he begins to send messages back and forth to Esther, telling her, we've got to do something. It's a little bit comical because it's like, if only we knew somebody who had the king's ear. And they go back and forth. And initially, Esther rejects this and hesitates. It's easy for us to read the story knowing the ending and not put ourselves in Esther's shoes because her hesitation is warranted. This makes sense that Esther would say, hey, do you know what's at stake if I go to the king without being requested? Her life is on the line if she does this. This is literally life and death that we're talking about. But Mordecai continues to push. And this is where Mordecai says probably the words, if you're familiar with any text throughout the book of Esther, it's this line here in verse 15, where Mordecai says, and who knows, but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this. Most of the time when I've heard this sermon preached or I've even preached it, I use this as like the turning point in the book. We're like, look, Esther has changed her ways. She's going to do something different. But as I studied this book for this sermon, I really tried to look at that relationship between Esther and Mordecai. This pair that has been together for a long time. That Mordecai has clearly influenced her life over an extended period of time. I don't believe for anything that this is the first time that Mordecai said something like this to Esther. I don't think this is a change. I think this is a reminder. She's probably heard this over and over again. Esther, you're here for a reason. Esther, your life has a purpose. Esther, I know that you're down. I know that you're sad. I know that you feel defeated, but I promise you, you have a purpose. You have a reason. And when he says this right here, it is that reminder that she needs to activate that courage within her. Again, this isn't the first time that she's heard this, but this is certainly the reminder that she needs. It's an important lesson that influence isn't a one-off. Influence isn't just a moment. Influence is a pattern. It takes time and energy and life to build influence with another person. It doesn't just happen in a moment. It happens over time. And because of this statement, what happens is Esther does have the courage to go to the king. And she tells him what Haman is planning on doing. And the king sides with Esther. And Haman has the same fate as the two royal guards at the beginning. If you've read the book of Esther, they're really big into stakes. The details are there. He has the same fate as everybody else, but what they do to honor Mordecai and Esther is they establish this holiday called Purim. It's really referenced here in Esther 9:22 as the time when the Jews got relief from their enemies, and as the month when their sorrow was turned into joy and their mourning into day of celebration. He wrote them to observe the days as days of feasting and joy and giving presents of food to one another and gifts to the poor. They established this holiday called Purim, where they do basically three things. They eat good, they drink good, they give gifts to each other and charity to the poor. But they also do something else. It's a tradition that's continued today. They read the book of Esther. They open the scrolls and they read through the book of Esther, continuing that influence that Esther had many, many years ago. But we know that this idea of influence isn't just with Esther. We've all had people in our lives that have influenced us. Maybe we realize it or not. I want to end with one more story about kind of an influential person that maybe some of you were influenced by, you didn't even realize it. The person that I'm thinking of is a lady by the name of Frances Heiselbein. Anybody by show of hands know who this person is? Do you really? Okay. I was like, the Johnsons just know everything. I was looking for Steve Johnson, but Frances Heiselbein was a secretary in the 1950s. And one day, she's at home with her 8-year-old son, and somebody knocks on their door. It's a woman from the neighborhood who goes around and she says, hey, I'm sorry to bother you, but Girl Scout Troop 17, their leader has moved away and they don't have a leader. Would you be interested in leading Girl Scout Troop 17 for our community? And Frances said, hey, I'm a secretary. I've got an 8-year-old son. I have no business being a Girl Scout Troop leader. And the lady said, oh, okay, I understand. Comes back about a week later, knock, knock, knock. I'm here because we still do not have a leader for Girl Scout Troop 17. Would you consider leading this Girl Scout group? She said, nothing has changed in a week. Still have an 8-year-old son. Still have no business leading this Girl Scout group. She comes back a third week, knocks on the door. And the lady's gotten kind of wise, so she says, look, if we don't find a leader for these girls, we're just going to shut down the group. So Girl Scout group Troop 17 just will cease to exist. Frances can't deal with that. It's a lot of weight on her. She says, you know what? I'm going to do this. I'll tell you that I will be their troop leader for 6 weeks until you find somebody else. Now, if you've ever volunteered for anything, you know where this story's going, right? Especially when you put a date in there. Those girls were 10 years old, and Frances was their Girl Scout troop leader for 8 more years. A 6-week volunteer position turned into 8 years with Girl Scout Troop 17. Now, in those 8 years, Frances read and consumed as much about leadership as she possibly could. She wanted to be the best person for these girls because she didn't feel like she was equipped. She didn't feel like she was ready. She didn't feel like she was the person that needed to be speaking into their lives. But that influence began to ripple. And she soon found herself being asked to be on Girl Scout troop councils and in regional things. And if you're familiar, and none of you were, but if you were to look up Frances Heiselbein on Google right now, there are quotes where people say she was one of the most influential CEOs of the 1990s. About 20 years after accepting that volunteer position to be the leader of Girl Scout Troop 17, Frances Heiselbein became the CEO of the Girl Scouts organization. They asked her, after an extensive search, to interview for this position. And she said, I have no business being the CEO of the Girl Scouts organization. There are other people with better resumes, with more talent, with more credentials than me. I cannot be that person. But the Girl Scout organization looked at her and said, you are the person that we need right now. Because they knew that she had the leadership skills. She knew that she was invested enough and she cared enough to do this. And her story is fascinating because in her tenure as the CEO of the Girl Scouts, she added 130,000 new volunteers. She also tripled the diversity of the Girl Scouts organization. And the thing that I think that I'm the most fascinated with is she took that cookie industry and turned it into a $300 million a year profit. she created a ripple effect that continues to this day because she was willing to open the door and say, you know what, I may not be the best person, but I'm going to be the person right now that steps through and helps out when I'm needed. Influence is rarely loud. This is something we've said a lot. It doesn't come with titles or applause. It's found in janitors who sweep with purpose, with family members who constantly encourage, and volunteers who say yes when the doors open, even if it's the third time. These are the people who shape the world, not from podiums or rocket ships, but through presence, consistency, and courage. And so what does this mean for us? I believe the story of Esther tells us that you don't need status to make a difference. You don't need certainty to live with purpose. You just need to show up, to be present, to be steady, and invest in others. So like Esther, know who you are. Like Mordecai, be courageous and consistent. And like Francis, be open to growth. Because when we live with intention, our influence will stretch further than we could ever imagine. God may never call you to a palace. God may never call you to a CEO's desk or a presidential office, but He will call you to help people. And that may be the greatest place of influence you'll ever know. So never doubt that what God can do through a faithful life, a steady presence, and a willing heart. Would you stand and sing with us?